Okay, so Zimbabwe entered a new era last year following the military's removal of President Robert Mugabe after 37 years in power. A new president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, immediately declared the country to be open for business, signalling his intent to attract new investment and re-engage the global community. But with many of the old guard still in place, how much has really changed in the country? And what does the new era have to offer potential investors? So this briefing is going to explore these questions, focusing particularly on four key things: the current situation, the 2018 harmonious elections, so these are simultaneous elections on July 30th, so the end of next month, for the presidency, the Senate, Parliament and local government, the economic and political outlook, and opportunities for investors. So the current situation, any discussion of the current situation in Zimbabwe obviously begins with the 2017 coup. I'm going to call it a coup throughout because I think many observers think it was, but recognizing that obviously ZANU-PF firmly denied that it was a coup. But I think we need to begin with this because it ousted Robert Mugabe after 37 years in power. And I'm sure many of you followed the events closely, but given their importance to what follows, I just want to run through a very quick summary. So in effect, the coup was a very public culmination of a long-running internal faction fight in the ruling party, ZANU-PF, over who was going to succeed party leader and president Robert Mugabe. And on the one side, you had the so-called G40 faction, Generation 40, which was aligned with Grace Mugabe and was believed to be President Robert Mugabe's preferred faction. And on the other side, you had the ultimately successful Lacoste faction, aligned with Emmerson Mnangagwa. Lacoste obviously coming from the fact that Mnangagwa is known as the crocodile, so the Lacoste was his faction. So just going back a little bit, Mnangagwa became vice president of the country in 2014, following the dismissal of Joyce Mujuru, and that made him the main rival to Grace Mugabe in the succession battle. And from 2016, he and Grace Mugabe clashed increasingly frequently and increasingly publicly. So Mnangagwa used his leadership of the Anti-Corruption Commission to attack leaders of the G40 by targeting them with highly publicised criminal investigations. And Grace publicly accused Mnangagwa of disloyalty and used her influence with her husband to sideline him and weaken his power. In August 2017, Mnangagwa became sick during a political rally and was flown to South Africa for treatment. And his faction claimed he'd been poisoned by Grace Mugabe. She denied the accusation, but she increased her calls for her husband to remove him. He was eventually removed from his post as vice president on the 6th of November after allegedly plotting against the government and displaying traits of disloyalty, disrespect, deceitfulness, and unreliability. It's not the first time he'd been accused of this. So in 2007, he was also alleged to have been involved in a foiled military coup. But after being removed from his post this time, he fled to South Africa, citing incessant threats against him and his family. On the 13th of November, so a week later, Defence Forces Chief Constantino Chiwenga issued a statement that purges of senior ZANU-PF officials like Mnangagwa had to stop, and this set the stage for the dramatic week that followed. So a very, very quick summary of that week. On the evening of the 14th of November, elements of the Defence Forces gathered around Harare and seized control of the Broadcasting Corporation and key areas of the city. The next day, they issued a statement saying it was not a coup and that Mugabe was safe, but that the situation would only return to normal after the Defence Forces had dealt with criminal elements within the party. On the 19th of November, they removed him as party leader and replaced him with Mnangagwa. They issued a deadline of the next day, the 20th, for Mugabe to resign the presidency or face impeachment. Mugabe didn't resign. So on the 21st of November, a joint session of Parliament and the Senate met for his impeachment. And sort of as the session convened, Mugabe sent a letter resigning the presidency. So Emmerson Mnangagwa was sworn in as Zimbabwe's third president on the 24th of November. It was obviously a very significant set of events. The removal of Mugabe, the liberation leader of the country, was symbolically huge. But it also crucially changed the balance of power within the ruling party and the government, with the Lacoste faction and the military really emerging victorious from this. And there were four key power brokers over this period who we'll see kind of come up again and again in the rest of the presentation. So obviously Emmerson Mnangagwa, who's now president, Constantine Chiwenga, who was then head of the Defence Forces and is now the vice president, Philip Sibanda, who is now commander of the Defence Forces, and Parence Shiri, who's now the Minister of Lands, Agriculture and Rural Resettlement. So they've all taken pretty important jobs in the current government. But as already noted, this was essentially an internal faction fight. And Emmerson Mnangagwa, who's commonly known as ED, so if I occasionally switch into that, that's who it is, he's very much a member of the old guard. He's been close to Mugabe for many years, and a lot of the worst things that Mugabe is accused of in terms of violence and the suppression of the opposition, he's actually accused of masterminding and carrying out. He's kind of been Mugabe's right-hand man, and to some extent his henchman. So the question really is, has anything changed as a result of this coup? Have we just had an internal faction fight, replacing one dictator with another, or is there actually real hope for change in the country and some new investment opportunities? So there's definitely been some positive change. Perhaps most importantly, there's been a clear drive by the new president to re-engage with the international community. So we've seen roadshows, we've seen visits by delegations, the country's applying to rejoin the Commonwealth. International observers have been invited to monitor the upcoming election, and just this week, I think it was Tuesday, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee has approved bipartisan legislation to lay the groundwork for US relations with the country and the lifting of sanctions. Mnangagwa is clearly very aware that international legitimacy is the key to accessing external finance, and external finance is central to improving the economy. So we've really seen a big drive on that. Mnangagwa is also seen as more open to economic reforms than his predecessor, and again, we've seen some positive moves for business. So Finance Minister Patrick Chinamasa, who's a key reformist, was one of his first appointments. He actually appointed the key reformist as a finance minister before he announced the rest of his cabinet. We've had some softening of the indigenisation laws and the announcement that the ministry is going to be disbanded. We've had a number of pro-business reforms proposed, including tax breaks for mining and agriculture, and plans to shield investors from the liquidity crisis by effectively ring-fencing new investments into the country so that money doesn't mingle with the general currency and people can still take it back out again. The IMF in April revised its 2018 growth predictions up from 0.8% to 2.4%, which is a reasonably significant increase, and they're predicting 4.2% in 2019 and 5% in 2020. And we've also seen a number of public attempts to tackle corruption and some increased freedom for opposition parties in the country. Unfortunately, not all the news is positive. So political change has been limited. Mnangagwa's cabinet, as I said, is still dominated by these former generals who were all complicit in Mugabe's era of oppression, central to the coup and this taking of power, and are continuing to drive government policy. And although there are reformers in important positions, such as the finance minister, a number of their warnings and recommendations have been openly ignored. So Chinamasa actually warned that Mnangagwa's wage and benefit increase, so he announced he was going to increase wages for civil servants and benefits for war veterans. And this was despite the fact that his own finance minister publicly warned that it was unaffordable, that it was going to increase the country's financial problems, and that he shouldn't do it. Citizens have also seen little material improvement so far, and of course it's perhaps unfair to judge Mnangagwa for the poor living conditions in the country. They were created by years of misrule. It's going to take some time for those to change. But frustration with the slow pace of change runs the risk of making populist policies, and in Zimbabwe those have always been land expropriation and indigenisation, more attractive. So there's concern that the liquidity crisis is going to take a very long time to undo or to deal with, high unemployment, poverty and informality, and the government just struggling to provide basic services. The country is also heavily indebted, and that severely hampers the potential for big change in the country. They've obviously paid back $110 million of arrears to the IMF in 2016, but they're still saddled with huge debts to the huge arrears to the, that should be arrears, not areas, to the African Development Bank and the World Bank, and total debts expected to reach $14.5 billion this year, according to the Finance Ministry. There's also a significant public deficit, which is going to be very hard to reduce in the short term. So currently about 90% of the government budget goes on wages. And as I just said, we've also had an announcement that there's going to be an increase in wages. And employment legislation in Zimbabwe also makes it incredibly costly, as it stands, to reduce the number of civil servants. So you're going to need to see some legislative changes before you can see that number brought down significantly. And the cost of this year's election is also going to put pressure on the public budget. And overall, it really remains a tough environment for business. So the World Bank and the Transparency International, it's worth bearing in mind that those were before the coup. So these are actually before Mnangagwa took power, but these of doing business rank is 159 out of 190, corruption's perception is 157 out of 180, poor infrastructure, and currently we've got huge political uncertainty. So Zimbabwe is therefore at something of a crossroads, and the future at this stage, I think, depends heavily on the experience and outcome of the upcoming elections. And these take place, as I said, the end of next month, on the 30th of July, and the crucial race here is obviously the presidential one. So you've got 23 candidates currently running for president, with the two frontrunners being Emmerson Mnangagwa of ZANU-PF and Nelson Chamisa of the MDC Alliance, the main opposition party. And this is the first time in over 10 years that we have new candidates for both of the major political parties. So it's a really important set of elections, but also quite an uncertain set of elections, because we don't really know how these two candidates perform as leaders of their party. Both sides are also riven with internal factions. So ZANU-PF is still reeling from the coup in November, and the primaries, which took place in May, resulted in widespread allegations of rigging and favouritism. We've had disgruntled members threatening to donate their votes to opposition parties. And the opposition's also been unable to form a united front. So we've got this really crowded candidate field of 23 candidates standing for president, which really means that it's sort of ZANU-PF on one side and then a lot of opposition parties on the other side. So that's likely to split the vote to some extent. And from a business point of view, I think there are two key things to think about with this election. So the first is whether or not they're likely to be free and fair. And that's going to significantly affect the country's ability to secure international finance and investment. So the US, the new announcement by the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee is they absolutely, if they're not free and fair, nothing else matters. They're not prepared to kind of go forward. And we're seeing that sort of rhetoric a lot. The second thing to think about is what's the likely outcome and what does this mean for the country? So dealing first with whether they're likely to be free and fair, there are a number of positives in this regard. So the first is huge global interest. So this is likely to provide some constraints on the ability of the government to kind of rig behind the scenes. There's a little bit more attention being paid. We've got EU observers in the country for the first time since 2002. There's also biometric voter registration. So this was intended to increase trust and confidence from the 2013 election. The voters' role in Zimbabwe has traditionally been where complaints about election rigging kind of focus. So they set up this new role, biometric, which is meant to sort of deal with some of those issues. As we'll see, there are new problems with it, but that was the goal behind it. The Judicial Services Commissions also appointed and deployed magistrates to deal with politically motivated violence. So they're really preparing for the possibility of violence and trying to do things to kind of keep that lower. There's also some evidence the government is trying to limit violence by its own supporters. So ZANU-PF called off a planned demonstration on June 5th because the MDC Alliance was also going to be protesting the same day in Harare outside the Election Commission, and they really were worried about clashes between the two, so they actually called off their own protest. And opposition parties have been allowed, for Zimbabwe, that's the caveat, to campaign relatively freely. But there are significant concerns, and 10 significant concerns, which isn't small. So the first, as I said, is the electoral roll. So this has long been a site of contention in Zimbabwean elections. And after numerous requests and complaints by the opposition, the Harare High Court has actually finally ordered the Electoral Commission to produce the roll. So on Monday and Tuesday of this week, opposition parties, civil society organisations lined up with hard disks to receive copies of the roll. Unfortunately, so first of all, this was only released, the courts had to get involved, the commission didn't do it on its own, and it was after the nomination court confirmed the candidates. By Zimbabwe's constitution, it should actually have been before. Accusations are also circulating that it's a fake list. So, as I said, it's a biometric roll this time, so there are pictures. The Zimbabwean Electoral Commission said it won't release the roll with pictures because it violates citizen rights, it makes it too easy for people to identify voters. But the opposition are saying, well, if you're not providing us with the full roll, how can we be certain it's an accurate roll? It's also incomplete, and this, I think, is really important. It misses those who registered during the inspection period. They're still being added to it. And crucially, it also misses those who are applying for postal votes. And the reason this is so important, so the deadline for postal vote applications is today. And the reason this is so important is because members of the disciplined forces are eligible for postal votes. They're the biggest group who are. And traditionally, the ghost voters that have appeared on the Zimbabwean electoral roll have been linked to either the police or the military. So the kind of the concerns around ghost voters is really a concern around them appearing on the roll, and you've got this huge group of people that aren't on the roll, we don't expect to be on the roll, we're probably not going to see them on the roll. So there's a pretty wide sort of area for some corruption there. There's also concerns around ballot papers. So the Commission remains secretive around the procurement of ballot papers. And again, that raises concerns about the possibility of fraud. If you don't know how many ballot papers are being produced, it's easy for ballot stuffing to occur. We also have a biased electoral commission. So the commission was originally set up as a government supervisory commission. So it was staffed by government members and it just was deployed during elections. In 2008, notoriously, it failed to declare a result for 45 days before claiming a runoff was needed between Tsvangirai and Mugabe. So it's got very low public trust. In 2013, it was actually reconstituted as an independent full-time commission, but it still contains many of the same employees, and at least 15% of its secretariat is serving or former military officials. So again, the military have kind of got their grip into everything around this. And recently released Afrobarometer survey data shows that close to half of registered voters have little to no trust in its neutrality. We also have biased state media. I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anybody. It tends to very heavily favour ZANU-PF, to cover ZANU-PF, to cover the opposition a lot less. A number of repressive laws still exist. So the Public Order and Security Act requires police notification for public meetings, rallies and protests. And there's a Criminal Law Act which also contains provisions that criminalise criticism of the president and the publication of false information perceived to be prejudicial to the state. So these have obviously been used extensively by the Mugabe regime to really stifle the opposition. The government so far has relaxed their use of them. So we're seeing open rallies, we're seeing protests being held, we're seeing some criticism of the sitting president, but they haven't been repealed, which means that, and this will get us shortly into the blast that happened last weekend, if things start to sort of tip in a way that concerns ZANU-PF, they have this huge legal framework to really crack down on the opposition. There's also been political violence, so we've got 71 verified incidents so far of political violence in the last 6 months. It's relatively low for Zimbabwe, but it's obviously still a concern. And then, of course, just last weekend, we had a blast at the ZANU-PF rally. And the big concern here is that it's going to be used by the government as an excuse to crack down on the opposition. Now, so far, Mnangagwa's response has actually been both measured and positive. So the state has offered some security to all the candidates. They haven't swung into accusing the opposition. In fact, Mnangagwa seems to be implying he thinks it's an internal matter. He's talking about it being his traditional enemies, who are the other faction in ZANU-PF. But there's still some concern about what's going to come out of the investigations into that and what that might lead to. We've also seen intimidation of voters. So Human Rights Watch have been logging incidents of intimidation by ruling party supporters in the rural areas. And the NDC Alliance has also established recently a militia-type uniformed youth group called the Vanguard, which has been implicated in several cases of violence and intimidation, both against ZANU-PF supporters and against other members of the opposition. Human Rights Watch has also found significant evidence of vote buying in rural areas. And there's a widespread public belief that the ballot is not secret, which obviously is problematic for the opposition, because if people believe that the government still has all of this repressive machinery and the ballot's not secret, the opposition's concerned that people are less likely to take a risk on voting for them. And finally, and to some extent perhaps the biggest concern is the military. So the military in Zimbabwe has a record of interfering in elections in favour of the ruling party. And of course the coup last year has strengthened their power within the party. It's also shown that if they think they're losing power, they're really happy to kind of go out onto the streets and take it. I mean, that's effectively what they did. A deputy minister in the government also announced publicly at a rally in late May that the military would never allow the opposition to take power. This has been said a lot by the military as well over the years, and although it was quickly denounced, it's still circulating as an idea. And again, Afrobarometer data that recently came out said the majority of voters don't believe the army would allow the opposition to take power. There are also some worrying reports at the moment. The latest figure I saw was that 2,000 soldiers have been deployed to rural areas. Again, the concern is it's likely to be voter intimidation. Even if it isn't outright voter intimidation, the history of elections in Zimbabwe means if you're a voter and you see the military, you're assuming that it might be intimidation. So they can almost sort of do it based on past records. And it's also very concerning that police officials were used as returning officers and security for the ZANU-PF primaries in April. So Mnangagwa actually condemned the practice, but he didn't impose any sanctions. And again, it's showing clear partisanship on the part of the security and the defence forces, that they were prepared to kind of come out and act as ZANU-PF officials, effectively. So free and fair, I think, is questionable. I think at the moment, the importance from Mnangagwa of securing international funding means that he would very much like these to be certified free and fair elections. I think he'll do what he can to ensure that that happens. But I think all of this suggests that they have the ability, if it looks like the election is going against them, to take it. They haven't changed a lot of the key legislation that people were hoping they would do. They're still deploying their soldiers. The Electoral Commission's being allowed to kind of mess around with the voters' roll in a way it shouldn't. And the intimidation of voters and vote buying, I think, suggests that they are prepared to take it if needed. So what about the outcome? Is it likely that this is going to happen? I mean, looking at the data we have on voters, so that was just the two things I've already said, that you've got little to no trust in the Commission's neutrality, and the majority of voters don't believe the army will allow the opposition to take power. About 5.8 million Zimbabweans are registered to vote, and many are first-time voters, so that complicates making predictions even more. Opposition rallies do appear to be increasing in size, so we're seeing bigger opposition rallies than we ever have. But it's really hard to assess what this means because we don't actually have a fair base level. The repression previously means we don't know if they're larger because the opposition actually has more supporters, or if it's just because their supporters are finally able to turn out and they're not actually increasing in size. Survey data, so this comes from Afrobarometer. It was a joint thing, but Afrobarometer released it. Afrobarometer data shows that they still remain several points behind the incumbent. They've increased, so Afrobarometer says about 31% support for the opposition to 43% to the government. There are other polls circulating that show very different results, including a number that are predicting a huge landslide victory for the opposition. The challenge with most of those is they're online polls. So they're heavily biased towards young people in their sampling, because it's people who have social media, people who are on Facebook, people who are using online news websites, and the focus on young people oversamples Chamisa voters. So his biggest support group is among the 18 to 30-year-old group. So if you're oversampling in that, you're probably getting a biased understanding of what's happening. And the Afrobarometer data is the best quality data I've seen so far, and they're still predicting ZANU-PF to be ahead. A breakdown of registered voters, we're obviously seeing very high levels of registration. And again, part of the reason that I think the opposition is struggling a little bit is, Chamisa's support really comes from this 18 to 30 year bracket, and they are currently the least likely to turn out. So the older people are registered and likely to turn out, 89%, 87%, and then 76% for the group where he really draws the majority of his support. So the likely outcome, as I say, the polls mostly show Mnangagwa ahead, although, as I've said, it's particularly hard to interpret poll and rally sizes this year. The opposition is divided, so you have this huge candidate field, and they're being significantly outspent. So some estimates suggest that ZANU-PF is spending $50 for every $1 the opposition spends, and that $1 the opposition spending is going among 22 candidates rather than the one ZANU-PF. And the opposition, it lost all of its traditional funders post-2013. So it really has, and because the coup happened in November, they've not had a lot of time to really pull themselves back together. The electoral playing field, for all the reasons we were talking about earlier, is still very much tilted in favour of ZANU-PF. So if the elections are free and fair, it doesn't look at present as if MDC support is going to be quite enough to upset ZANU-PF. The important question then becomes, if that changes, either it just gets closer and ZANU-PF gets worried, or they actually do overtake them, is what Mnangagwa is going to do. So the question that's been circulating is he a statesman restoring democracy? Was that what he did in November? He stepped in to say, we need to become a legitimate government again, we need to restore democracy. Or is he a man with not a democratic bone in his body? As I said, he does know he needs international legitimacy to access necessary financial assistance, so I think that is going to push him towards trying to make them as free and fair as possible. But he's backed by powerful vested interests in the military who would have an awful lot to lose if ZANU-PF lost power. So if it starts to look concerning, I think there will be huge incentives for everybody within ZANU-PF to try and just gently tilt the election a little more in their favour. So as I say, I think they're going to work hard to keep the elections looking free and fair, but the coup last year makes it likely that the government will intervene if it finds itself under serious threat. So far there's been, in terms of kind of looking ahead now, so we've got these elections coming up. What's likely to be happening beyond those? Well, so far we've seen lots of positive rhetoric and window dressing from Mnangagwa. He's made a lot of kind of the right murmurings of pro-business support. He's promised a lot of policies. He's promised to dismantle a lot of things. We've got courting of international investment and attempts to normalise international relationships, and some clear efforts by Parliament to tackle corruption. As I said, the election is going to be a key test. If ZANU-PF loses or feels forced to kind of steal it, it could lead to violence. It would be hugely detrimental for the economy. Even if they win outright, however, so the kind of best possible scenario to some extent is a peaceful elections, and let's say that Mnangagwa follows through on all of his pro-business rhetoric. Real change is likely to be slow and incremental. And this is because we have a number of challenges to change. So the first are these backers and vested interests. He needs to continue appeasing the military, civil servants and war veterans. Those are the big groups he needs to continue appeasing. Most of these would like to see the economy improve, which is why I think we have a real moment of possibility here. And they'd like to see relations with the outside world improve, but not if that change threatens the balance of power within the parties or their own vested interests. So that's likely to mean that change is going to be slow, just to avoid creating instability within the government and within the party. We've also, Mnangagwa and the Zimbabwean economy is just starting from a really poor starting point. The economy suffered years of damage, and it's going to take time to recover. The liquidity crisis is critical. They need to get cash back into the economy. That relies on funding coming in internationally. It relies on exports so that they can get foreign currency back in. And that's just going to take time. They're heavily indebted. You've got this widening public deficit, and the government has said that it hopes to reduce it by half in 2018, but that seems highly unlikely given the wage bill, given the proposed wage increases and the organisation of the elections. Very underfunded infrastructure, poorly run and chronically underfunded state-owned enterprises, and a lot of damaging legislation to undo. So they've just got a lot to do, which means that inevitably it's going to take some time to do. Sort of the slow pace of change, so citizen unrest, the slow pace of change, which I think is almost inevitable given the first 2 points, may make populist policies attractive again. So, if the slow pace of change leads to citizen unrest, people are getting frustrated by the fact that their material life isn't improving quickly enough. It may make these populist policies attractive, and as I said, in Zimbabwe these have been really detrimental for the economy. They've been land reform and indigenization, and those really are the two big things I think anybody investing in Zimbabwe needs the country to move away from. And the international community remains wary, so ZANU-PF really has a poor reputation internationally. People don't trust ZANU-PF, they don't trust the government, they know who Mnangagwa is. So the international community are making very positive noises. They're all meeting with the new government. They're all saying we would like to offer support, but very few are yet committing at anything like the levels needed. At the moment, everybody's saying we need to see if the elections are free and fair, but I think they're still going to be hesitate to invest huge amounts in the country because people just don't trust yet what this new government's going to look like. So free and fair elections and paying off the debt arrears are important steps in gaining investor confidence, but I think it's going to take a little time. So bearing all of this in mind, what are the opportunities for business? In the short term, I think the country remains relatively high risk, certainly until we've seen the election and the outcome and have some sense of that. But I think multinationals willing to accept some risk could benefit from first mover advantages here, only if the new administration meets the economic reforms it has promised. But I think there are there are likely to be significant opportunities. If the elections go well, if we get these proposed reforms being followed through on, I think significant opportunities are going to emerge in the country. Its proximity to South Africa makes it relatively accessible. And the country also has a very strong talent pool, particularly if the new government can woo some of the diaspora back, and leaked documents from cabinet meetings suggest this is likely to be a key drive of the new government. So both, we've seen kind of murmurings that some of the farmers might be invited back to help with the agriculture thing, but we're also getting strong evidence that they're hoping to bring back this pool of talent to the country. So what are the opportunities? So in terms of just equity investment, probably worth holding off on this for a little bit. So locals have because of the liquidity crisis, locals have piled into equities as a means of getting money out of the country. So the premium in local equities, which here is measured by the difference between the cost of old mutual shares in London and in Harare, is significant. It's obviously shrunk hugely when Mugabe was forced out of power, but it's still hovering at around 2. So, shares in old mutual shares in Harare still cost about twice what the same shares cost in London. And really, until that gap shrinks further, I think it's probably worth holding off there. Agriculture, I think, is a huge area, and there's a lot of opportunity here. It's a key sector bringing in foreign exchange, so it's a high priority for the government. This is where they've made some of their biggest moves so far. They've already introduced reforms to give agricultural firms better access to finance. We're seeing promises of better funding, we're seeing promises of changes in some of the legislation, and we're seeing these rumours circulating out of cabinet meetings that they're going to try and bring some of the farming talent back to the country. So machinery, seeds and irrigation systems are likely to witness a particular surge in demand in the sort of short to medium term. Consumer-facing businesses, I think there's another big area for opportunity here. So there's a large unmet demand for lifestyle and consumer goods in the country among the elite and middle classes. So we've been seeing restaurant chains from South Africa slowly moving up into Zimbabwe and doing very well. KFC is beginning to open an increasing number of restaurants, Ocean Basket coming up from South Africa. Lower income customers are also presenting a lucrative opportunity. So Unilever has done exceptionally well here, basically selling smaller package sizes at low unit cost but higher margins. And because the country's been very cut off for a long time, there are really big opportunities here for firms that move in the short to medium term. The tourism sector is also likely to see an increase in the next 2 to 5 years. It's always been quite a good sector. For the country, Victoria Falls is a big draw. It's close to South Africa, and South Africa obviously is a huge tourist market. So we see a lot of people coming to do these package tours, South Africa up into Botswana, South Africa up into Namibia. Zimbabwe's really hoping to begin to capitalise on that, particularly as the reputation of the country hopefully improves. People become slightly less concerned about safety and security, and crucially infrastructure. So we've got some big infrastructure projects planned connecting the two countries. Technology, there's some concerns here. So mobile banking and cash transfer solutions have been doing exceptionally well. So the liquidity crisis means people have really turned to things like M-Pesa, Bitcoin, to just bypass the need for cash. Unfortunately, in May, the Zimbabwean central bank ordered finance houses to stop processing virtual currency payments with 2 months to put this into effect. They're arguing it's risky, that it could destabilise the economy. So I think that's raising some concerns that they're going to increase regulation around some of these mobile banking and cash transfer solutions. But increased funding and government support has been promised in the technology sector. Infrastructure and healthcare, so there's obviously a high need here after years of underinvestment. In the short term, I think the government's likely to focus on debt and basic services, but in the medium to longer term, it's going to look to and going to need to upgrade infrastructure and health systems, resulting in significant opportunities. That said, because of the high levels of political interference, I think it's worth being cautious with public-private partnerships just until we have a little bit more political stability. And overall, I think it's probably a good time to be buying local assets. They're priced in US dollars, which does make them a little bit more expensive, but the high risk means they're still relatively cheap. Look for local business partners. Everybody is desperate for investment at the moment, and so beginning to find business partners now really gives companies the pick of that. And to invest cautiously in certain sectors, so some of the sectors already mentioned. I think at the moment it's probably best to avoid sectors with high levels of political interference. These are the sectors that just are most dependent on what happens in the next sort of 6 to 8 months with the government. As I said, that's public-private partnerships, but particularly mining. So we're seeing positive sort of signs from the government around mining. They're beginning to talk, we've had some of the most damaging indigenization rules have been softened. So the rule that foreign mining companies had to be 51% locally owned has been softened. We're seeing the promise that some other things are going to be changed. We're seeing the promise of some tax breaks for companies investing in mining. But we still have really opaque black economic empowerment rules. And the same legislation that softened these indigenization laws also strengthened the ability of the Minister of Mines to declare certain minerals, strategic minerals, for a whole range of reasons, and which would then make them much more subject to government control, and the government would have the right to kind of begin to determine prices that they're selling at, to take control of certain mines. So although we've seen this kind of relaxing of indigenization, I think there's also some cause for concern in the kind of legislation that was snuck through at the same time. And of course, for anybody interested in investing in Zimbabwe, I think at the moment it's particularly crucial to obviously follow developments closely. This is likely to change quite quickly. We've got the election coming up, that's going to be key. The balance of the cabinet after that's going to be very important. It's going to need a huge amount of flexibility. This is likely to be something that changes very quickly, both within the country, but also because of the risk and the concerns of international investors. You're likely to see small changes in Zimbabwe leading to huge shifts on markets and investments. So flexibility is going to be important. Avoiding reliance on headline indicators is particularly important for Zimbabwe. So most headline indicators such as GDP just really don't reflect the spread of wealth in the Zimbabwean economy. You've got a small group of elite who've done incredibly well out of the ZANU-PF regime, who are very wealthy, who have a lot of disposable cash, but you then have a very, very large impoverished population. You also have a powerful informal sector, which often isn't well captured by these headline indicators. And again, as in most of sub-Saharan Africa, as I'm sure all of you know, you also have these heavy urban-rural cash flows. So people living in rural areas are sending remittances back to urban areas, to rural areas, which means the spread of wealth is a little less, the networks and the spread of wealth is a little less easier to predict just from a GDP headline indicator. And finally, to be aware of differences between business regulations on paper and those in practice. So this has always been the case in Zimbabwe, but uncertainty is likely to increase in the short to medium term. You've still got this very repressive, this very controlling legislation from the Mugabe era. You've got Mnangagwa making all of these hints and suggestions, and really what's going to be key is how those two come together. How's the legislation changed? How is the implementation of the legislation changed? So navigating differences there are essential to successfully taking advantage of the opportunities the country presents over the next months and years. And that's me.